There were exactly 216 people in the sanctuary that Sunday. I know because I'd counted the offering envelopes before the service began. Numbers calm me, they always have. What I couldn't count was the number of heads that slowly turned toward me. My wife had just taken the microphone. Nobody expected her to speak. Neither did I. She smiled warmly at the congregation, folded her hands, then said something that made every face in the room change. "Before Pastor Allen begins today's sermon, I'd like everyone to pray for my husband." The church became silent. She sighed dramatically. "He's losing his mind." A few people gasped. Others lowered their heads, thinking she was about to share heartbreaking news. Instead, she laughed. "I know he doesn't realize it yet, but he honestly believes people here are stealing from the church." Scattered chuckles drifted through the pews. I remained seated. She looked directly at me, still smiling. "Poor Daniel. Yesterday he accused our own finance committee of hiding money." More laughter, so someone behind me whispered, "That's sad. Not because they believed me, because they believed her." "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 66 years old for 32 years. I worked as a forensic accountant for non-profit organizations, hospitals, scholarship foundations, international charities. My entire career involved one responsibility: following money. No matter where someone tried to hide it, I had investigated organizations across 3 continents, recovered millions in missing funds, testified before oversight boards, retired with every professional certification still intact. Then, one Sunday morning, my own wife convinced an entire church that I couldn't trust my own mind. Rebecca and I had attended Grace Covenant Church for 28 years. She directed the choir. I managed the annual building audit, not because anyone forced me, because I enjoyed balancing books, every receipt, every donation, every maintenance invoice, clean Sybil Lot Trent. Until 6 weeks earlier, the first inconsistency was tiny, a check for $12,000 roof repairs, except the roof had already been replaced 3 years before. I assumed someone had reused an accounting code. It happens, so I politely asked the treasurer. He smiled nervously. "I'll look into it." He never did. Then came another payment, $38,000 community outreach equipment. No invoices, no delivery records, no equipment. Still, I didn't accuse anyone. I simply asked for clarification. Rebecca overheard the conversation. That night, she surprised me. "Daniel, maybe it's time someone else handled the finances." I laughed. "Why?" She kissed my forehead. "You've been obsessing lately." Obsessing? I'd reviewed church accounts for almost 3 decades. Nothing about this felt unusual except her reaction. 3 days later, Pastor Allen called. His voice sounded careful. "Daniel, Rebecca mentioned you've seemed overwhelmed." I frowned. "Overwhelmed?" She thinks retirement has been difficult. It was the first time I'd heard the phrase retirement confusion. The second time came from my daughter. "Dad, Mom says you've become suspicious of everyone." Then my brother-in-law, then 2 church elders, different conversations. Exactly the same concern. Almost as if someone had been repeating the same story to everyone. And now, here she was, standing at the front of the church, turning concern into public entertainment. She lowered the microphone, walked back toward our pew. As she passed, she squeezed my shoulder, almost affectionately. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're all praying for you." The congregation smiled kindly, not at me, at her. I didn't stand. I didn't defend myself. I simply reached into my Bible, removed a folded sheet of paper, not financial records, not bank statements, just a handwritten list. Every person Rebecca had spoken to during the previous month, every conversation, every identical phrase, every time she'd quietly suggested that I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. I hadn't written the list because I was afraid of forgetting. I'd written it because patterns always reveal themselves eventually, and this one was only beginning. I didn't speak to Pastor Allen after the service. I asked him for a key. He looked confused. "A key?" "To the old record room." He hesitated. "It's been years since anyone used it. I know, I'd like to." Grace Covenant Church had occupied the same building for nearly 80 years. Down a narrow staircase beneath the fellowship hall, there was a forgotten records room. Dusty shelves, old ledgers, boxes no one had opened in decades. Every financial report, every building permit, every committee minute. Nothing glamorous, just history, Most people didn't even know it existed. I did, because 20 years earlier, I'd volunteered to organize it. When I unlocked the door, the smell of old paper greeted me like an old friend. Numbers don't gossip. Paper doesn't panic. Records don't care who wins an argument. They simply wait patiently for someone willing to read them. 3 hours later, I wasn't looking at missing money anymore. I was looking at disappearing accountability. 5 years ago, every church expense required 3 signatures. Today, only 1. 4 years ago, committee meetings produced written minutes. Now, most decisions were described as approved verbally. 3 years ago, annual audits were reviewed publicly. Last year, the audit presentation quietly disappeared from the congregation calendar. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. None of those changes proved theft. But together, they proved something else. Someone had been removing witnesses. One policy at a time. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Not Pastor Allen, not Rebecca. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, 84 years old, church secretary for nearly 40 years before retiring. She knocked softly. "I heard you were down here." I smiled. I suppose word travels fast. She looked around to make sure no one else was nearby. Then she reached into her handbag, pulled out a faded spiral notebook. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." It wasn't an accounting ledger. It was Eleanor's personal notebook. Every committee meeting she'd attended, every unusual discussion she'd witnessed, dates, names, conversations, nothing official, just observations, the kind only someone who quietly watched everything would write. She turned to a page marked with a yellow ribbon. "Read this." 6 months earlier, Finance Committee meeting Rebecca had attended, even though she wasn't on the committee. According to Eleanor's notes, Rebecca suggested something unusual. "Daniel worries too much. He's becoming confused. Maybe we should slowly reduce his responsibilities before he embarrasses himself." I stopped reading. "She said that?" Eleanor nodded. Almost everyone laughed. I didn't. Another page. 3 months later, Rebecca again. "Daniel keeps imagining problems. Please don't argue with him. Just agree and move on." I slowly closed the notebook. This hadn't started in church. The church was simply where she'd decided to make it public. Eleanor poured 2 cups of tea from an old thermos. "You know, I watched your wife for years. She never attacked anyone directly. She preferred planting thoughts." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "If enough people hear the same story, they stop asking whether it's true. They start assuming everyone else already knows." That sentence settled deep inside me. Rebecca hadn't been trying to win one argument. She'd been preparing an audience, long before she ever picked up that microphone. The following Wednesday, the church hosted its monthly volunteer breakfast. I almost didn't attend. Then I remembered something my father used to say. "If someone wants you to disappear, the worst thing you can do is disappear." So I went, not to defend myself, just to help. I stacked chairs, poured coffee, washed dishes. No speeches, no accusations. Just ordinary work. Something unexpected happened. People started approaching me, one by one. Quickly, a retired teacher whispered, "I've never thought you were confused." Then a youth leader. "I've been wondering why everyone suddenly started saying that." Then an elderly deacon. "Funny, every concern about you seems to have come from the same person." I smiled politely, said nothing, because people trust discoveries far more than explanations. As I carried another tray toward the kitchen, I overheard Rebecca speaking with 2 choir members. She didn't know I was nearby. "He probably won't remember any of this next month." They nodded sympathetically. Then one of them asked something Rebecca clearly wasn't expecting. "If Daniel's memory is getting that bad, why does he still balance the church budget better than anyone?" Rebecca froze. Only for a second, then she laughed. "Oh, some days are better than others." The conversation moved on, but I noticed something for the first time. Someone hadn't accepted her story immediately. A single crack had appeared. And people don't usually notice the first crack in a stained glass window until sunlight begins shining through it. I never asked anyone to choose sides. People imagine truth spreads because someone shouts louder. It doesn't. Truth spreads when lies become too exhausting to maintain. The following Monday, Grace Covenant received an unexpected visitor, not an auditor, not the police, not anyone connected to the church. A woman in her early 70s named Judith Monroe. Very few people recognized her. I did. She had chaired the non-profit governance council that trained volunteer boards across the state. For 25 years, she had taught churches how to protect themselves from internal conflicts. Retired now, widowed, quiet, exceptionally observant. She wasn't there because I invited her. She was there because Eleanor had. Judith spent the morning doing something wonderfully boring. She asked for policy manuals, committee charters, meeting calendars, volunteer handbooks, not financial records, processes. Because she believed organizations rarely collapse because of missing money. They collapse because people stop following their own rules. Around lunchtime, she found me replacing burned-out light bulbs in the fellowship hall. "You still volunteer? Every Monday," she smiled. "Interesting." "What is?" "The man everyone claims is unstable is still the one quietly doing the work." By Wednesday evening, Judith requested a meeting, not with me, with every ministry leader, Choir, finance, outreach, maintenance, youth ministry. Rebecca sat in the front row, confident. She assumed the meeting was about modernizing church operations. Instead, Judith walked to the lectern carrying only a legal pad, no projector, no presentation, just questions. "Before we discuss governance, I'd like to conduct a simple exercise." She wrote one sentence on a whiteboard. "Who first told you Daniel Mercer was losing his memory?" People looked around. Nobody answered immediately. Then one hand rose. "Rebecca." Another. "Rebecca mentioned it to me." Another. "I heard it from Rebecca after choir practice." Another. "She warned me before a committee meeting." Judith quietly made tally marks, one after another. Nearly every answer led back to the same person. She nodded thoughtfully, then asked her second question. "Who has personally witnessed Daniel forget something important?" Silence, complete silence. One man finally laughed awkwardly. "I've actually never seen that happen." A retired teacher spoke next. "Neither have I." Then another. "And I've worked with Daniel every week for 15 years. Rebecca's smile slowly disappeared. Judith erased the board, then calmly said something no one expected. "This isn't a memory discussion. It's a reputation campaign." Nobody moved, she continued. "When one person repeatedly supplies identical concerns without independent observations from others, that isn't evidence, that's influence." The room became so quiet. You could hear the old ceiling fan turning. Rebecca stood abruptly. "So now you're accusing me?" Judith looked genuinely surprised. "No, I'm explaining organizational behavior. If the explanation feels familiar, that's something only you can answer." Rebecca gathered her purse. "I'm not staying for this." She walked toward the door, then stopped because Pastor Allen spoke for the first time. "Rebecca," she turned. His voice was gentle, not angry. "I've spent 6 weeks praying for Daniel. I've just realized I never once asked him whether anything was actually wrong." He looked toward me. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words changed the room, not because they solved anything, because they gave everyone else permission to question what they'd accepted. Rebecca left without another word. The door closed quietly behind her. Nobody chased after her. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. People simply remained seated, thinking sometimes silence is louder than confrontation. Later that evening, as volunteers stacked hymn books, Eleanor sat beside me. "You know, I've been here 48 years. I've watched arguments split families. I've watched money divide churches. But I've never seen something quite like this." "What?" She smiled softly. "You didn't spend 6 weeks trying to prove your wife was lying. You spent 6 weeks letting everyone discover they'd stopped asking questions." I looked around the empty sanctuary. The stained glass windows glowed orange in the setting sun. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to make the truth unnecessary to defend. Because once people started asking their own questions, Rebecca's story no longer needed an opponent. It simply stopped making sense, and she still had no idea that the most difficult conversation of her life was waiting at home. Rebecca wasn't home when I arrived. The lights were off. The house was silent. On the kitchen counter, there was a single sticky note: "Tour rehearsal. Don't wait up." I smiled sadly. There hadn't been choir rehearsal on Thursdays. For almost 3 years, she'd forgotten, not because her memory was failing, because she'd gotten used to saying whatever was convenient. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't throw anything away. Instead, I walked upstairs, opened the small cedar chest at the foot of our bed. Inside were 34 anniversary cards. Every birthday letter I'd ever written her. Every postcard from every city we'd visited together. I tied them together with a blue ribbon, placed the bundle in the center of the bed. Then I left, not forever, just long enough to remember who I had been before every conversation turned into an apology. For the next 2 weeks, I stayed in the apartment above the church library. It had been empty since the previous caretaker retired. One room, a tiny kitchen, books lining every wall downstairs. Children came after school. Older members stopped in for coffee. Nobody asked why I was there. They simply treated me like Daniel, not the man losing his mind. It was remarkable how quickly a lie dies when people stop repeating it. One Saturday morning, a little girl wandered into the library carrying a torn children's Bible. "Mr. Mercer, can you fix books?" I laughed. "I can certainly try." We spent an hour repairing loose pages with archival tape. When we finished, she smiled proudly. "My grandma says, if something is precious, you repair it carefully." After she left, I sat quietly for a long time, because I'd spent months trying to repair a marriage with someone who didn't believe it was precious anymore. The following week, Pastor Allen visited. He carried 2 cups of coffee. "I owe you another apology. You already gave me one. Not for believing Rebecca, for something else." He looked embarrassed. I realized I kept asking whether the church needed protecting. I never asked whether you did. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he asked, "What are you going to do now?" I looked through the library window. Sunlight spilled across the front steps where children were reading together. "I'm going to stop chasing someone who keeps running away from the truth." Sunday arrived. The sanctuary was full again. Rebecca directed the choir beautifully, as she always had. When the final hymn ended, she walked toward me, not smiling this time. "You embarrassed me." I shook my head gently. "No, you built a story, and people eventually noticed it didn't fit." Her voice softened. "I said those things because I thought people trusted me. They did, they still might, but trust isn't something you spend, it's something you protect." She looked away. For the first time in our marriage. She had no clever joke, no sarcastic smile, no audience, just silence. 3 months later, Rebecca stepped down from leading the choir, not because anyone forced her, because she said she needed time away. Someone else took over. The choir kept singing, the church kept serving, life kept moving. That's the strange thing about believing you're the center of every room. The room usually keeps going after you leave it. As for me, I accepted a new volunteer role, not with the finance committee, not auditing books. I began restoring the church library, old hymnals, historical journals, handwritten records from families who had worshipped there for generations. Every restored book received a small stamp inside the cover. It didn't bear my name, only a simple sentence: "Truth survives careful keeping." Years from now, children will open those books. They'll never know my story. And that's perfectly fine, because the greatest victory wasn't proving my wife wrong, it was refusing to let her convince me that I needed everyone else's permission to know who I was.